If there is an MBTI for personality types, I firmly believe there should be one for note-taking styles. You can be the Pinterest aesthetic note-taker who probably owns 15 different colored pens and highlighters, the scribble everything and hope for the best note-taker who will write every single word down but will also probably forget everything later on, or the minimalist risk-taker who fully trusts their brain to remember everything. At some point, I think I've been every type of note-taker, and whether I was scrambling to write everything down or spending a lot of time perfecting my handwriting for absolutely no reason at all, the worst thing that can happen is looking back at my notes and realizing I don't even understand any of these. So let's talk about practical, actionable strategies on how to actually take notes the right way. In our last video, we talked about the study cycle and how this cycle lays out the most important steps to learning. The first of which is skim the textbook, the lecture slides, or any of the assigned learning material before the class. I used to just attend the class and dive straight into taking notes, thinking the more I wrote, the more I learned. But I realized I was just passively copying, trying to keep up with the lecture, trying to jot every single word down without actually understanding. So eventually, I have just a bunch of scribbles that I probably won't even understand by the end of the day. When you read the material before class, however, you have an idea of how the lesson is structured, what the key concepts are, and which concepts are most difficult to understand. Think of it as similar to solving a puzzle. It is far easier to solve a puzzle when you look at the final picture first instead of just guessing where the pieces might go. You'd have a goal, you would easily see how one piece of the puzzle fits with another, and you'd recognize any missing pieces. So before the class, read the learning objectives of the chapter because this will give you an idea of the goal of the lesson. Take note of the headings and subheadings because this will guide you with a roadmap, a direction to the flow of the lesson. Skim through the content. You don't have to understand everything in depth yet. Just take note of the key terms because these will likely be mentioned during the lecture. Lastly, read the summary. This will have the most important takeaways you need to remember. Trust me, this will only take you 10, at most 15 minutes, but this will totally change your note-taking game. Now, if lecture slides are provided before class, in which case you are beyond lucky, take advantage of that resource. Print out your slides and highlight the headings, subheadings, and key terms. If you have any questions, write them down on the side or simply write question marks beside them. Now, use these as an outline to write your notes during class. You won't have to feel lost, you won't have to make sense of the lecture on the spot. You already have a foundation of the lesson and you can just focus on building on that and filling in the gaps with the information you learned during class. My notes used to look like this, just a bunch of words, just a bunch of topics, one after the other. This made it so much more difficult to see the connections between different concepts. So when I reviewed using these notes, I saw everything as isolated. I reviewed this section first, this section next, and this section after. So my memory consisted of individual, isolated pieces of information. Learning, however, does not work that way. Learning is all about making connections. The more connections you create in your brain, the better you understand and retain information. So instead of having literally a wall of text, create a consistent structure that you can use every time you write your notes. For me, for instance, I've already put together a note-taking template that I simply duplicate every time I write my notes. This creates a structured format where you can see how the lesson is logically arranged. I have heading blocks that create an outline for my document so I can see that this section is under this one and this other section is under another. When you have this structure, you spend less time trying to decipher your notes and trying to make sense of how everything is connected with each other. There is a quite interesting concept I learned recently, and that is called the split attention principle. Imagine this. You're reading a textbook, you're reading paragraphs after paragraphs worth of explanation. You have to flip through a few pages to see the diagram, then you have to go back again, read the paragraph, flip through to see the diagram again, and then go back to reading the paragraph again. At some point, you lose your place, you forget what you've just read, and it just gets frustrating. And this happens quite a lot when you're reading textbooks or handouts. That is exactly what the split attention principle highlights. When information is scattered, our brains are doing the extra effort to piece everything together on its own. Our brains are working harder to make connections, to integrate how this part of the text explains this part of the diagram, and to even see how everything is related to each other. The more scattered the information, the more strain it puts on your memory. So how do we fix this? When you're taking notes, integrate different sources of information physically or temporally. Instead of having the text and the diagram separated, annotate directly on the diagram. This is why I prefer creating my own diagrams for my notes. I am able to follow along the diagram and add notes directly on it as I'm explaining the concept. Instead of having a separate document for your lecture notes and for your textbook notes, figure out which concepts are similar to each other and merge it into one document. So let's say I'm using my lecture notes as the foundation. If I read an important concept from the textbook or from an online article, I'm not going to take note of that in a separate document. Instead, I'm going to find which heading or which specific point from the lecture that relates to. This way, everything seamlessly flows in one place and your brain is able to dedicate the extra effort for actual learning. Color coding might seem like an extra added effort, but science actually backs the idea of using colors to help you study more efficiently. When you assign specific colors to different types of information, key terms, examples, you're visually categorizing the content. You're making important concepts stand out. You're basically guiding your attention to the most important elements of your notes. You don't have to stress out searching for that one specific concept, and you're even freeing up space in your brain so it can focus on just absorbing information. The challenge, I think, and the frustration we all have who take notes during class is how quickly the lecture moves from one topic to the next. Information comes at you fast. 1 second you're keeping up with the lecture, you laugh with your seatmate, and then boom, you're suddenly 5 topics behind. This is why it's useful to take advantage of symbols and abbreviations when note-taking. I've listed out a few. I'm sure there are many more you can think of depending on your course and depending on the lesson. This might take you a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you do get used to using these symbols and abbreviations, you'll write less but still learn more. A lot of students think that note-taking is a one-and-done kind of thing. You write your notes during class and you're done. You just have to review it before the exam. But I'm gonna hold your hands when I say this. Notes aren't magic. You gotta do more than just writing it once. I, for instance, follow 3 key steps when writing my notes: recording, building, and reviewing. First, I record all important points during the lectures, again using abbreviations and symbols. Second, I build on that lecture notes and I add information from the textbook, from journals, and from other resources I find online. I do this after the lecture, either by the end of the day or after a couple of days. Lastly, I review my notes. I change the colors of the key terms, I delete any points that are redundant or irrelevant, and I add any information that I think is missing. Again, I do this after a few more days. Why do I layer my notes when I could have just relied on my lecture notes to study for the exam? I know it's easy to give ourselves a pat on the back when we've successfully kept up with the lecture, but when you take notes during class, again, everything is so fast-paced. And truth be told, not everything is gonna fully sink in your brain. But when you go back to your notes later on, you're giving yourself time to actually process the information. You are better able to see how to organize your notes and whether there's any missing info. At the same time, each time you go back to your lesson, you're reinforcing your memory and your understanding of that lesson, making it easier to review later on. Again, one of the difficulties in taking notes during class is the uncertainty that comes with lectures. You don't exactly know what to expect, you don't know how the professor will structure the lesson, and you don't know what new concepts will come up. That's why we alleviate that problem with reading before the class. But another way to overcome that challenge is to actually learn from those who came before you. You don't always have to start from scratch when you're taking notes. Think of it, there are already hundreds of students who took the same course before you. They've already sat through the lectures, figured out what's important, and maybe even take a note of the exact concepts that show up on the exams. Do not be afraid to ask for their notes. However, use their notes only as a guide. I know some of you will ask for their notes, copy everything, and call it a day. That's not what we're here for. Use their notes during class to figure out what's different and to fill in the gaps. By doing so, you're actually giving yourself a head start. You can use their notes as a foundation and you can just layer in with the information you learned during class. Lastly, a simple habit I've learned to incorporate in my note-taking process is keeping track of my references. There are several ways to do so. In my notes, for example, I change the bullet point symbols to categorize information. So those from the textbook are marked with a book, while those from online references get a magnifying glass. You can also change the colors instead, so say you're using black for lecture notes and then gray for textbook notes. Either way, these make it easier to distinguish where certain information came from. You can also keep a list of your references at the end of your notes, and this I use for video references. Why does this matter? Mainly for efficiency. Usually, when I write my notes, I write them weeks before the exam. If I don't record my references, I would find myself, after a few weeks, scrambling to find a certain line from a certain website, thinking, I swear, I read this somewhere. Instead of doing all of that again before the exam, which can be time-consuming and quite frankly, exhausting, I can just jump straight into the right references. I don't need to spend so much time and I don't need to stress over where I can find a certain concept from. That wraps up today's video. I know I've listed out quite a lot of tips, but remember, note-taking isn't about doing more work. It's about taking note of the lecture strategically. It's about making your notes actually work for you. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for sticking around. I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye!